For centuries, the history of early Sri Lanka has been completely dominated by a single, epic story. But what happens when we take that grand narrative and subject it to rigorous archaeological scrutiny? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unraveling a fascinating detective story to uncover the true origins of early Sri Lanka. We're going to move past ancient texts and look directly at the beautiful weathered megalithic stones that define this incredible landscape.
So, here's the bedrock of that universally accepted narrative, the classical model of colonization. According to this deeply entrenched story, Indo-Aryan, language-speaking Sihala settlers traveled all the way from North India and colonized Sri Lanka back in the 6th century BC. It's an epic tale of arrival, conquest, and foundation, and it's basically influenced virtually all traditional historical views of the island. But to really grasp this story, we first have to understand who actually wrote it down.
The narrative we just talked about comes directly from the Pali Chronicles, specifically the Dipavamsa and the Mahavamsa. These are incredibly important ancient texts that serve as the traditional historical foundation for Sri Lanka. But, and this is a big but, they weren't written by modern objective historians holding clipboards. They were meticulously compiled by Buddhist elders, and these elders had a very specific primary interest: the history of Buddhism and its foundations on the island. So this wasn't just a recording of facts, it was a deeply purposeful project.
Scholar B.C. Law actually hits the nail on the head regarding the mindset of these chroniclers. Notice his observation here. The chronicles are driven by two distinct motives. You've got the devotional, which is sectarian and puritanic, and the patriotic, which is national and racial. The author of the Mahavamsa is even frank enough to admit at the end of each chapter that his compilation is, quote, for the serene joy and emotion of the pious, right? So these elders were essentially narrative architects. Their works were fundamentally meant to serve an ideological function, rather than acting as some neutral historical ledger.
Because of these underlying motives, our main task today is extracting actual historical facts from all this ideological exuberance. When we look closely, legends like the famous arrival of Vijaya really shouldn't be seen as literal history. Instead, think of them as a meticulously crafted myth of legitimization. The chronicles used these foundational stories to legitimize the Buddhist tradition and essentially conquer the island conceptually, both politically and culturally. It's an absolutely fascinating way to build a civilization's identity, for sure, but it fundamentally distorts the physical reality of how people actually settled there.
Let's break down exactly what the Vijaya legend claims. The absolute crucial point here is that this assumes a massive demographic shift. The classical version of the story asserts that these North Indian invaders arrived in the 6th century BC and committed a complete or partial genocide, literally replacing the existing population. Interestingly enough, the text claims that at the time Sri Lanka wasn't even populated by humans but by non-human beings like Nagas and Yakas. Furthermore, it specifies that Vijaya's companions founded their villages specifically in the north and northwestern regions of Sri Lanka. We're looking at a very specific, dramatic, and sweeping set of claims that demands an equally massive amount of proof.
Which naturally brings us to the ultimate investigative question. If a massive migration of North Indians came down, completely replaced the local population, and set up extensive settlements in the north and northwest, well, where is the physical evidence? Where are the objects they brought with them? Where are the remnants of their unique culture buried in the dirt?
When we contrast these two elements side by side, a glaring reality emerges. On one hand, we have the loud, epic claims of massive North Indian migrations echoing from the texts. But on the other hand, looking at the clean, high-resolution reality of actual archaeological excavation sites, we get absolute silence. When we actually look at the physical archaeological record to confirm these grand textual claims, there is a total disconnect.
Let's get into the specific details of that missing evidence. Scholar Senaratne actually went out looking for these early settlements. He meticulously surveyed a triangle bound by Pudalam, Karadativu, and Toboa in the northwest. His conclusion? There are absolutely zero finds which could be traced to North India. None. Furthermore, if this was a hostile takeover, why is there no evidence of physical resistance from the native South Indian populations? And perhaps the most glaring piece of missing evidence of all, the earliest Brahmi inscriptions in Sri Lanka completely lack the name Sihala or Simhala. If these first Aryan settlers gave the island this name, they would have been known by it from the very beginning, right?
5. As in 5 centuries. That is exactly how long it took, after the alleged settlement, for the Vijaya legend to even emerge. It literally didn't exist at the time the event supposedly happened. The earliest references to Sri Lanka as Sihala only show up around the 3rd century AD in Indian epigraphical sources and literature, like the Tamil epic Silappadi Karam. What does this mean?
It means the story of Vijaya was created 5 centuries later, specifically to account for the later application of the name Sihala to the island. It was produced by Buddhist elders based on what they believed and what they needed for their religious narrative at that specific later time.
Therefore, this traditional story of a massive, single-wave Aryan invasion is essentially a fictional overlay masking a much more complex reality. The Chronicles are describing a cultural infiltration, the spreading of religious and cultural ideas, but they wrongly attribute it to a large-scale physical migration of people. Just like the Agastya legends in South India, you really don't need a full-scale demographic invasion for a local population to thoroughly assimilate new cultural traditions.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real truth of the matter. When we map out the geographic areas where the myths say these early settlements were founded, something incredible happens. They perfectly coincide with the actual physical zones of the island's indigenous megalithic cultures. Reality was sitting right there all along. The so-called Aryan colonization was just laid directly over the map of existing indigenous cultural evolution and assimilation. Even more fascinating is that the Chronicles couldn't completely erase the truth. They kind of just hid it in plain sight. Woven right into these legends is a persistent, factual core, the tradition of Pandu. Now, while some have tried to link this to the Pandavas of the Mahabharata, the Pali Chronicles of Sri Lanka consistently use the term Pandu to refer to the Pandyas of Tamil Nadu in South India. This reveals a deep, undeniable historical entanglement with the South that the chroniclers tried their absolute best to gloss over. Just look at this observation by scholar C.W. Nicholas. Even in the very legends designed to promote a North Indian origin, the chronicles admit that the leaders of these supposed first Indo-Aryan arrivals immediately sent envoys down to the Pandyan king in Tamil Nadu. They relied heavily on the south to obtain wives, craftsmen, and material assistance. The historical data consistently indicates that the very foundation of this early civilization was heavily supported by South India. So what's the actual reality here? It's a southern reality. The evidence points completely away from a single massive wave of North Indian invaders and points directly toward a deeply nuanced history of trade, exchange, and steady migration from South India. The local populations had incredibly close contact with Dravidian speakers in Tamil Nadu. But because of those devotional and patriotic motives we discussed earlier, the chroniclers desperately wanted to create a singular, unified North Aryan origin story. So what did they do? They synthesized all this complex Southern integration right out of the primary narrative. To truly understand the dawn of human intellect and the origins of Sri Lanka, we have to be willing to look past the ideological exuberance of ancient texts. Now, don't get me wrong, the Chronicles are beautiful, they are religiously significant, and they are masterful works of literature and cultural identity. But they just are not the literal history of how the island was populated. The real story of its people is written in those silent, ancient megalithic stones bathed in the golden light of history, not in the crafted myths of later generations.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Cultural myths are incredibly powerful tools, right? They give people identity, they give them purpose, but they so often mask the beautifully complex realities of human assimilation, trade, and shared existence. When the loud, epic claims of ancient texts contradict the quiet reality of archaeological evidence, we really have to ask ourselves, when grand historical narratives clash with silent stones, who really gets to write our history? The victors who hold the pens, or the generations who actually worked the stone? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and until next time, keep digging for the truth.